Ukraine, and many other countries besides that. He was one of the most important figures in the foundation of the Atrocity Prevention Board, which was an all-of-government agency that was the only of its kind. It, like many other things in American government, no longer exists. To bring different actors from different agencies in the government, including defense, intelligence, commerce, treasury, USAID, and state, et cetera, to regular standing meetings to discuss and plan for atrocity responses. Prior to his work at the State Department, he had a long and distinguished career in civil society, working with and for all kinds of organizations you've probably heard of: Open Society, Justice Initiative, the International Center for Transitional Justice. He was also, as a lawyer, worked for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He lost his job, and subsequently the entire Office of Global Criminal Justice, I believe, which was one of the I think the jewels in the crown of America's efforts to hold war criminals and other perpetrators of mass atrocities to account and to deter others, has now vanished completely. We're thrilled to have him here with us to talk about his recent experiences and to help us think of a way forward from the present catastrophe of American foreign policy. The title of his talk is Rehoming Atrocity Prevention, Imagining a Future for U.S. Foreign Policy. We're honored and delighted to have him as our visiting practitioner, and so please join me in welcoming David Mandel-Anthony.
Well, thanks to the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocities Prevention, especially to Max and Carrie and to Provost Hall for the warm welcome I've had this week. It's been great to engage with so many of you, students and faculty here at Binghamton, and participate in this really rich dialogue you have in this university. That was far too generous and far too much. I told Max to not read my bio, but he doesn't listen. So you were subjected to that. My talk today is a reflection on the role of atrocity prevention and its twin, transitional justice, in the foreign policy of the United States. And over the past 2 decades, how it has evolved, how it has risen, and now fallen. And I'll offer some thoughts on whether, how, and under what conditions atrocity prevention can figure into U.S. foreign policy in the future, at a time when our own democratic institutions are under grave threat, and the risks of political violence and authoritarian repression are among the highest since perhaps the American Civil War. For the past 13 years, I was a part of this story, serving as a diplomat at the State Department, as Max mentioned, on atrocity prevention and accountability across 4 administrations, working as a nonpartisan career civil servant. It was my professional privilege and sometimes my great personal frustration to work on these issues within the machinery of the U.S. government. I focused on countries around the world, some that had experienced mass atrocities decades prior, 34 years, some countries that were experiencing ongoing conflict and mass atrocities, and many countries that were at severe risk of future recurrent mass atrocities. So let me first start by sketching how atrocity prevention figured into U.S. foreign policy from around 2007 to the present. I promise not to make this too painful of a history lesson. Looking first at presidential directives and policy-making structures, and finally some legislation. I think it's important to start with the task force that started in 2007. So 2007 Genocide Prevention Task Force, and it laid out broadly the intellectual rationale and the operational blueprint for why genocide and atrocity prevention should be an articulated pillar of U.S. foreign policy. The task force was formed during a presidential transition year. It aimed to influence whoever was elected, spoiler alert, Barack Obama. A blue ribbon commission, it was housed under the U.S. Institute of Peace and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and it was co-chaired by 2 eminent figures, the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, and the former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen. As an aside, it was Secretary Albright who founded the office I worked for 13 years. She established and created the position of the War Crimes Ambassador in the late 1990s to provide her with policy advice during a period of international justice renaissance that saw the creation of international tribunals for Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and of course, the Permanent International Criminal Court. And the thaw that followed the Cold War had opened up a rare geopolitical alignment that yielded a moment of intense international cooperation on justice as a matter of international peace and security, pursuant to the UN Charter. It was out of those primordial geostrategic waters that the beast of atrocity prevention first crawled. The Genocide Task Force urged a bunch of things. First, that atrocity prevention should be part of US foreign policy as a national priority, led from the president downward and embedded in government institutions and processes. The report argued further why the US should care, more on how that rationale evolved later across different administrations. It argued not only that mass atrocities undermined US interests through regional instability, refugee flows, spillover threats, the rise of terrorism, and damage to US reputation and credibility. Most importantly, it laid out operational recommendations for how the US could prevent mass atrocities by employing a comprehensive whole-of-government approach. Toolkits that included early warning, diplomacy, capacity building, targeted resource allocation, military planning, sanctions, norm strengthening, and that sexy beast, interagency coordination within the US government via a standing atrocities prevention board in the National Security Council. The Obama administration took up the call through the visionary leadership of Samantha Power, then senior director at the President's National Security Council staff. In Washington, we have an adage that personnel is policy, and that was certainly true with her appointment. And by 2010 and 2011, the Obama administration had erected the process, structures, and directives to embed this commitment structurally inside the US government, foreign policy making apparatus. This came through presidential study directives, establishment of the Atrocity Prevention Board, and military planners were drafted into the process as well, producing military doctrine and military planning handbooks known as mass atrocity response operations, exploring the role of the military in atrocity prevention. In May 2016, hoping to embed this architecture for whichever administration was elected that fall, spoiler, Donald Trump, President Obama issued an executive order further codifying a lot of these structures. And in 2019, Congress exercised this legislative prerogative to pass the Elie Wiesel Genocide Prevention Act and the Global Fragility Act, signaling a bipartisan commitment to atrocity prevention and also perhaps signaling some wariness that without a legislative backstop, the Trump administration would disengage from these efforts. But back to the Obama administration. In addition to the directives and the executive orders, there was a restructuring of government itself, establishment and reorganization of agencies, bureaus, and offices to focus specifically on the foreign policy goal of atrocity prevention and accountability. This was especially notable within the State Department with the creation of the J Bureau, J for Justice, all the soft power and human rights offices and bureaus, and of course, an empowerment of the U.S. Agency for International Development. But it extended to U.S. law enforcement agencies. I often worked with my counterparts in ICE DHS, FBI, the Department of Justice, who all had specialized law enforcement units aimed at ensuring the U.S. was not a safe haven for perpetrators of mass atrocities abroad. And I helped them investigate these crimes across the world and cooperate with their counterparts in other national law enforcement offices. The intelligence agencies, too, also got in the game. They created dedicated offices on atrocity prevention and accountability. They devoted resources to analyzing which countries were most at risk to better inform policymakers. It truly was a whole of government approach. And beyond the government, there was a thickening of the field and the discipline in the United States. US non-governmental organizations and quasi-governmental organizations like the US Institute for Peace and the Holocaust Museum and academic institutes like IGMAP hone their skills not just around study, research, and advocacy for atrocity prevention, but they also built and refined tools, models, and techniques that would be necessary for policymakers to use, such as early warning networks, risk indicator frameworks, annual lists. All of this reinforced an interplay and mutual exchange between the US government and NGOs, and it deepened the normative and operational frameworks for atrocity prevention. So this is the how and the what of the heyday of atrocity prevention in US foreign policy. But to answer the question of whether atrocity prevention efforts were effective, I think it's important to look at the underlying rationales across these 4 different administrations. And to do that, I look at the national security strategies produced by every administration, and it's a useful way to understand the thinking of the US national security interests. In the 90s, President Clinton didn't use the explicit terms like preventing genocide or mass atrocities, but instead he talked about human rights and international justice as part of US interests, including support for international courts and tribunals, including a permanent court. President Bush, in his first term, also didn't use the explicit framing of prevention, but instead talked about human dignity, general norms of freedom, peace, and democracy. By his second term, however, the 2006 National Security Strategy was much more explicit. It stated genocide must not be tolerated and claimed that if unaddressed, regional conflicts can lead to failed states, and committed the US to work on conflict prevention, conflict intervention, post-conflict stabilization, justice, and reconstruction. And unsurprisingly, under Obama, both of the national security strategies that he produced contained entire sections explicitly titled Preventing Genocide and Mass Atrocities. It tied the project to the norms of the responsibility to protect doctrine, with clear commitments to mobilize, quote, all instruments of national power, diplomatic, humanitarian, financial, sometimes military, to prevent and respond and hold perpetrators accountable. And it stressed that prevention is more effective and less costly than dealing with the aftermath. President Trump's 2017 strategy, it kept some explicit declaratory language, like we will hold perpetrators of genocide and mass atrocities accountable, but it was vague on the operational details. It didn't attach that goal to multilateral mechanisms or norms, and it didn't name any specific instruments or institutional tools that would be used for that goal. President Biden returned to some explicit references, even naming Xinjiang as a specific mass atrocity situation of concern to the United States. It emphasized accountability, alliances, and coalitions. But again, it was pretty vague on the details. Interesting, those are linked to broader strategic competition and norm competition rather than the underlying undergirding norms of human rights. And President Trump has not yet released a national security strategy. So when he does, I'll update my speech. But let's put all of these in context. Post-Cold War moments saw the US in a triumphalist mood, believing it was dominant in a unipolar moment and generously willing to use that power to cooperate with international mechanisms and frameworks to advance international justice. But by the early and mid-2000s, the US, still feeling powerful, had sort of soured a bit on the international cooperation part of that equation, instead casting prevention as a moral responsibility of the US, which in its self-conception was perceived as the flag bearer of freedom and democracy, and when need be, the sovereign power that would act through military intervention, sometimes on its own, not overly constrained by those Lilliputian multilateral objectors. Obama blended the two approaches in one simple sentence, which is attached to his national security strategy. Preventing mass atrocities and genocide is a core national security interest and a core moral responsibility of the United States. So what's the through line of all these approaches? Well, bear with me here, but for anyone familiar with American comic books and the ways in which the rise of those comic books coincided with America's self-conceptualization after World War II, you'll recognize what is known as the Spider-Man proverb. With great power comes great responsibility. But it was, of course, a bit more complex. Another through line was that accountability and prevention were viewed not only as essential for international peace and security, stability, multilateralism, democracy building, and what we used to quaintly call the international rules-based order, but the underlying premise was that all of those things were in the national interest of the United States. There were varying degrees of buy-in from Republican and Democratic administrations to this premise. Broadly speaking, not a fundamental disagreement in kind. And now that premise seems to have been rejected wholesale by this current administration. Indeed, in some views, this administration poses a threat to democracy at home and abroad, allying with illiberal regimes such as Hungary and Poland, while spurning and using its power to destabilize democracy in our putative allies in Europe. It rejects almost wholesale the premise that international and multilateral frameworks, laws, and institutions can enhance American power and advance American interests. And it has even begun to politicize and weaponize the concept of genocide itself, as seen in the perversion of US refugee admission policy to benefit white South Africans and almost no one else. So when the US cared about atrocity prevention, were we effective at it? I'm not an objective grader, but I'd give it a B-, averaging out a bunch of criteria. The effectiveness was low to medium. The commitment and prioritization was medium, and the application was often selective and uneven. There are a number of prosaic and bureaucratic reasons for this. It's hard to mobilize and coordinate across the US government. It's hard to focus on proactive, long-term prevention work when government requires constantly reacting to new and ongoing crises. The hardest thing, to quote the musical Hamilton, is to be in the room where it happens. That is, to ensure that atrocity prevention is significantly prioritized enough alongside other foreign policy goals so that it affects the outcome of decisions made at high levels. The creation of the Atrocities Prevention Board achieved this. We got in the room and we were there influencing decisions. We didn't always win, but we were there. This board largely became moribund under Trump and Biden, and yet the architecture persisted. Lots of offices doing the work, lots of programming of foreign assistance, and lots of influencing policy at lower levels, but the influence diminished. These bureaucratic impediments and the fact that atrocity prevention had to compete with other policy priorities were to be expected. Competing priorities and more important forms of self-interest would often be more important than the full mobilization of US power to prevent atrocities. But more profound reasons for the limited effectiveness of atrocity prevention efforts had to do with the contradictions at the heart of US foreign policy. When President Obama came to power, it was somewhat still of an open question as to whether the United States would work to address and pursue accountability for the serious human rights violations committed pursuant to the global war on terror. And the answer clearly became no, encapsulated by Obama's mantra, oft repeated, that the US would, quote, look forward rather than back. No serious attempt was made by the US to examine the torture program or extraordinary rendition. And this decision, one of many, created an enduring gap between the US commitment to international norms and the structures of international justice. And this gap ultimately weakened those norms and structures. It was, to many critics, do as I say, not as I do. And it bared a selectivity bias. The US, beginning with the Bush administration, which many people forget, was willing to support the International Criminal Court. And it did, but only in those situations we determined were in our national security interest. That included backing the Security Council referral to the court of the situations in Darfur and Libya, but also it involved supporting the court diplomatically, technically, with intelligence, and with law enforcement assistance for every single country that the court investigated, over a dozen. except for investigations into the United States and Israel. Here's another more recent example. In January of this year, the Biden administration, on its way out of the door, issued a formal determination that the rapid support forces in Darfur, Sudan, were committing genocide against the local population. This determination was important, and I had worked on it for almost a year, as well as the previous one, which found war crimes and crimes against humanity. But to my dismay and disappointment, it failed to acknowledge, name, or impose consequences on the United Arab Emirates, which was and continues to be the main enabler of this genocide by providing vast amounts of financial and military support to the RSF. Here's another set of contradictions or omissions. I was proud to mobilize the US to support accountability for atrocities committed decades ago in places such as Chad under former dictator Hissène Habré and in Guatemala under former President Rios Efrain. Both of these bloody tyrants were justly prosecuted decades later with significant US support and involvement. Pursuant to the theory, again, back to the rationale, the US commitment to atrocity prevention also failed to grapple with a similar elephant in the room. Without the Biden administration's untrammeled military support to Israel, that country could not have carried out the war in the way that it did. As we continued apace with mobilizing the whole of government to prevent and mitigate continued atrocities in diverse places such as Burma, Nicaragua, Sudan, Colombia, Ukraine, and many more. Even as we provided historic levels of support to the International Criminal Court for its investigations into Russian perfidies in Ukraine, while threatening to sanction the same court for investigating Israel, it all seemed to be so blatantly selective, and it raised increasingly difficult questions to answer. Did we still have a moral imperative for atrocity prevention? Or had that goal been completely severed from its twin, national security interest? And now were our motives purely self-interested and based solely on a realistic deployment of American power? Of course, the Trump administration didn't dwell at all on these uncomfortable questions or seek to reconcile those contradictions. Instead, it moved swiftly and decisively to dismantle all of the atrocity prevention architecture, doctrine, policy, and practice that had been built for the past 20 years, including under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Almost all the offices of the State Department sought to work on these issues were closed and eliminated, as well as USAID, which now means that almost no development assistance will be provided by the US for the goals of conflict prevention, atrocity prevention, or democracy promotion. What's left is a conception and implementation of US power that doesn't much care about values or morality, and instead views the world through the lens of geostrategic rivalry, great power politics, pure transactionalism. So to imagine the future of atrocity prevention in US foreign policy, we must first confront a stubborn myth, the myth of American exceptionalism. And for decades, this narrative has framed our global engagements as inherently benevolent, a story in which we are the arbiters of justice and the bearers of moral clarity. Yet history and experience tell a more complex story. When I was at the trials for Rios Montt and Hissène Habré, even while present and speaking officially on behalf of the US, I felt the conspicuous silence of what I was not saying. And those are examples of places where we decided to be on the right side of history. Acknowledging missteps is difficult, morally, politically, and psychologically, but it's essential. Understanding where and why choices went wrong, whether in Gaza, Sudan, or Burma, or Ukraine, is the only way to shape a future foreign policy that is consistent, credible, and genuinely committed to preventing atrocities. And it's in these moments that the gap between American self-conception and practice becomes starkly visible. The Spider-Man proverb resonates deeply with those of us who have served in government, because we sought to harness American power toward humanitarian ends. But we must distinguish between power itself and moral courage to wield it wisely and fairly. Power without accountability risks enabling atrocities rather than preventing them. And to prevent atrocities, power must courageously be paired with accountability and consistency. And this is where the concept of rehoming atrocity prevention becomes critical. Too long, our efforts were framed as imported, externally imposed, something America brought to the world from a pedestal, rather than a practice that emerged organically from our own history or implemented domestically. But it need not be foreign to the American experience. Here at home, communities are already grappling with legacies of racial injustice, political violence, and systemic inequality. Truth-telling, reparations, reconciliation, these are instruments of atrocity prevention, and they are being applied experimentally, but meaningfully across the United States. So a recent report by Howard University that chronicles these various initiatives across the US, surveying over 90 at the local, state, and community level that address these historical and ongoing injustices. And this report gives me some optimism. It reflects a quintessential innovative American spirit at the state and local level. Discusses, for example, reparations program in Evanston, Illinois, first US municipal initiative to direct financial compensation to descendants of Black residents harmed by discriminatory housing policies. It examines the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding school policies to investigate the legacy of forced assimilation and abuse in those boarding schools. And non-governmental entities entered the fray. The Episcopal Diocese of Texas pledged $13 million in reparations to address its historical ties to slavery. But while transitional justice initiatives in the US are growing and significant, atrocities prevention tools, techniques, and approaches are much less so. Going back to the Albright-Cohen Commission report of the late 90s, the kind of tools, institutionalization, data documentation, lexicon, models, techniques that it called for the US to adopt in our foreign policy, they only exist in the US in very early and fragmented stages. Things like early warning frameworks, offices in local and state governments to formulate policy around atrocity prevention, the application of risk indicators to monitor, and crucially, the documentation of human rights violations and abuses, those are scattered and lacking. Atrocity prevention can be practiced inside the US with the right infrastructure and approaches. To do so, we must overcome hurdles rooted in our exceptionalist mindset that convince us it cannot happen here. And we must connect those lessons and that history at home to coherent foreign policy approach abroad. Government service taught me one very simple truth, which is that progress often comes from learning to work with people even when you disagree and you lose. Put another way, I'm used to losing arguments and then continuing to work with people I lost those arguments to. And rehoming atrocity prevention will require precisely this kind of humility. It requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about past US actions, while simultaneously building structures and narratives that enable the moral and strategic consistency in the future. And I would argue that this inside-out approach, turning inward to have a more effective, holistic, consistent, and grounded US foreign policy is not just desirable morally, but a necessary condition of pursuing our self-interest in any future US foreign policy. To close, in that sense, rehoming atrocity prevention is not just about policy, it is about identity. It is about recognizing that American power, when paired with American responsibility, can serve humanity rather than simply our own self-interest and convenience. It is about identifying with pluralism and the strengths that come with pluralism. And it's about transforming our lessons, failures, and aspirations into a strategy that is about as much as who we are at home as about what we do abroad. And if we do this, if we truly integrate reflection, accountability, and imagination into the machinery of US power, then we can offer the world not just our might, but our credibility, not just our rhetoric, but our example. And that's the promise of rehoming atrocity prevention. And it's a promise worth striving for. too long. I'm
No, it's
here.
wonderful. You can field your own questions.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was great and uplifting in the current circumstances. But the part you
Was it so?
I mean, in a way.
Okay, in a way.
I mean, after some of our conversations this week, where I did actually feel like, oh no, things are not going well. This was a moment of, at least a path forward. But what you just mentioned about thinking about who we are at home and abroad, that stuck out to me, and I was wondering if you think historically who we are at home, who we see ourselves at home and abroad has aligned. I would think of it as maybe that was not aligned, but I'm curious to your thoughts on that.
No, it is not always aligned. There have been efforts to make it more reflective. So I was part of a group of State Department people who wrote a report all about trying to increase diversity in the workforce at the State Department. And we had to come up with different arguments, right? One argument was that, simply put, it's hard to engage with the diversity of the world if we are not a diverse workforce ourselves. For decades, until probably, I don't know, the 80s or something, the State Department was known as, anybody know this? It's the saying, it was pale, male, and Yale. Anybody heard this? Right? So it was incredibly gendered, incredibly classist. It was not a workforce. And that's just the workforce. Maybe another way to answer your question, and I've talked about this with some of you in some of your classes, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s did a very interesting strategic thing, and it took advantage of the Cold War rivalry between the US and the USSR, where on the world stage, we tried to present this, again, in like superhero comics, as like good versus evil, and we were all good and they were all evil. And the civil rights movements tried to disrupt this narrative at international institutions and frameworks by pointing out segregation as a form of apartheid and as a form of violation of inherent human worth and dignity, which was called for in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that was an example of people trying to get the US to be better at home by pointing out the mismatch between its self-conception and its image abroad. Yeah. And then you in the back.
So my question was, how do you think the current moment of sort of complete backtracking on atrocity prevention in US, like national foreign policy, how do you think that is kind of impacting and going to continue impacting atrocity prevention at the international level? Because it kind of occurred to me while you were talking that as the U.S. has, increasingly, stopped cooperating with, the states we used to cooperate with, I've also noticed, sort of particularly thinking about Gaza, that a lot of those states are now doing things that I can't really imagine them having done years back, such as, like recognizing Palestinian statehood and, like actions that South Africa was taking, stuff like that. I'm just interested in knowing your thoughts on that.
People talk a lot about dependency relations between powerful states in the global north and the global south. I don't even like those terms, but whatever. But people talk less about dependency problems between the US and Europe. So my view is that since World War II, the US has really been kind of a guarantor of European security. I know I'm being recorded this, I'm sorry to all my European friends. But oftentimes the Europeans take the lead of the US. And I think that there's a mantle that we've dropped and there's a lot of soft power that we have decided to walk away from right now. And that's there for the taking. and it's also necessary for others to take up the mantle. There are limitations to that, and there are reasons why the U.S. had such an influential role even on our allies. We're powerful, and we had a lot of power. And we also helped rebuild Europe when it was in rubble after World War II. And so they owed us a debt, and they felt it morally, psychologically, politically, right? But there are going to have to be new alliances and new formulations that don't seek to exclude the United States, but recognize sometimes that we may not be the most helpful rower in the boat. And I think you're right that you start to see some things happening that wouldn't happen if the U.S. were still around, exerting its, still around, but if the U.S. were exerting its influence on international institutions in the way that we have previously. We still have an enormous reserve of institutional power because the multilateral frameworks that were erected after World War II contain certain inherent advantages for the U.S. That's just the design of those mechanisms. And we also have, just our own hard power, economic power, military power, but it's those other domains of power, like soft power, influence, normative behavior making, where we're squandering it, and others can pick it up if they want. I think you were next.
Yes, thank you. So as you discussed transparency and accountability, there's a lot that the U.S. is obviously lacking, but what central pillar of transitional justice is significantly missing from the U.S. In terms of atrocity prevention that you think needs to be better implemented?
Well, like I said, I think the U.S. is experimenting with a lot of transitional justice right now. It's fascinating. You all should read this Howard report, not just because my office commissioned it, but because it's a really amazing, surprising survey. So there are truth commissions, there are reparations, there's a lot of memorialization work happening, including around the Confederacy, right? We had that moment and it's continued. But like I said, I think what is missing is an explicit atrocity prevention lens inside the United States. It's there. I don't know if she's here. There was someone at a talk this afternoon who had a good rejoinder to me and said, no, there are groups documenting human rights violations and abuses. It's just they're considered sort of fringe and marginalized. And I think that's true, but I'm not sure they're expertly trained in the techniques and even the vocabulary to talk about human rights violations the way we talk about them abroad, right? Do we say enforced disappearances or do we not say enforced disappearances here? Well, if we say that term, do we know how to back it up with documentation and evidence? What legal standards are we using? Once we have collected evidence that we think meets that legal standard, where do we go with it? What avenues or pathways of justice exist at the national or international level? Those are all questions that people who work on atrocity prevention and documentation and investigation abroad, they train their organizations on, and they build techniques and approaches. That's just one example of the kind of atrocity prevention. I don't want to like overly paint a picture of sort of inadequate infrastructure in the United States, but a lot of the ways that we talk about issues or exist in silos, right, between academic freedom or trans rights or civil rights, journalistic freedom. These are not sort of seen as elements of atrocity prevention agendas holistically and in ways that are linked. I don't know if that answers your question. You were next, then you. Help me keep remembering that sequence.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting discussion here. And I just have one thing to say. For instance, now the US, looking at this influence in terms of global atrocity prevention lenses, but also with your work right now at that particular level. and its failure also to create checks and balances with its internal and sometimes it's like, now I see the challenge of the dismantling of these structures. So what impact will actually this leave the US in the global landscape, particularly when it comes to handling atrocities? Because if they destroy these structures, it becomes very challenging for other rest of the world to be able to probably maybe look into that, maybe take them as an influence. So what are those negative and positive also impacts that this might create for the US?
You mean internally or abroad? Well, for one thing, to be quite realist about it, I think it will diminish U.S. power ultimately. And when and if we take up the imperative of having a values-based human rights policy, foreign policy that includes human rights, I think we will have to take a realistic assessment of the ways, in specific ways in which our power has diminished. A lot of those ways will be through reputational damage. A lot of those ways will be through loss of influence over other countries or other actors. There will certainly be a credibility and trust gap. So we'll have to reassess if we get there. So it's a complicated question. I hope I attempted to answer it. Okay, who is next? You.
Yeah, my question is, there seems to be like a general sort of tension between the idea of building soft power, as you say, versus like pursuing human rights as sort of like an end in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, a lot of these programs, don't they sort of seem to promote like the U.S.'s soft power and image, but that never seems to be paramount when the U.S. is making final decisions. And I see like it's like the U.S. can build soft power, but then when it comes to prioritizing U.S. alliance, like one with Israel over Gaza, doesn't that seem to always like come, it just seems to sort of launder the United States' reputation or construct a moral image rather than necessarily improve people's material conditions and lives on the ground, although that may not be a universal.
Yeah, I mean, these are some of the contradictions that I pointed to in U.S. foreign policy, right? That there are limits to how much we care about atrocity prevention. And some of those limits bump up against other forms of self-interest or alliances. And it's that gap, that contradiction that I think has to be narrowed if we're going to have an effective foreign policy based on atrocity prevention. I think maybe this is me just like having residual defensiveness as a U.S. diplomat, which I have to keep reminding myself I am not. But I think you overstate your case slightly about it all being sort of hollow rhetoric and about promoting our self-image. We did a lot of good around the world. We did great work and sometimes effective work on preventing atrocities. People wanted our help and they asked for it. And we gave it many times, right? We had a stabilizing force in international affairs. Not always, right? And it's those not always bits that I'm urging us to be sort of self-critical about, while also not being too absolutist about the value of American power. Who is next? You? Sorry, I've lost track. Yeah, go ahead.
I think I have a couple of questions that developed since my first question. My first question kind of, it goes back to what you said in your sort of speech, which is if we turn inward, and I guess I kind of wanted more clarification on the we and what you actually mean by turning inward beyond sort of broader policy statements. And then additionally, you commented on documentation and whether or not people are using appropriate language that's used globally and sort of in the field itself. do you feel like there is value in non-academic documentation, especially, I would say, I'm thinking about the United States right now and a lot of things that are going on. What value do you see that having in global courts, I suppose? And do you ever think that there's going to be a space where atrocity prevention really is discussed in a way that kind of, what's the word? Can go across whether or not someone has academic training or not? Can this be something that's not legit?
I do not think you need academic training to do atrocity prevention work. I think there are frameworks that academics can help develop, especially tools of historical inquiry that are very important. And when I say turn inward, I suppose I'm coming from a very transitional justice perspective that identifies areas in need of repair. And it does seem like we need a lot of repair in the United States right now. And that we are riven by grievances and factionalized identities and partisanship. And that all of that is sort of spinning out of control that unravels not just who we are at home, but who we can be internationally. That's all very conceptual. But when I say turning inward, I mean, what's the work look like to do that repair, to document, to examine the places where our institutional and civic life is frayed, and try to propose solutions and be problem makers, problem solvers rather than problem makers. Identifying risks is part of that, right? But atrocity prevention is not just about predicting risks. It's about developing lots of tools. Do we say peace building in the United States? No. But there's a whole field of people, and I used to know a lot of people who were employed in that field who did peace building around the world, right? We don't do that at home. Why not? What does that look like abroad, and why can't we do it here? Adapted and tailored and adjusted. What does it mean to take seriously atrocity prevention as a discipline, which has, like I said, largely been developed not just in ways that are instrumentalized by U.S. power, but in ways that had its own craft, its own techniques, its own ontologies. I'm on a campus, I get to use words like ontologies now. They never would have let me use words like that in a speech at the State Department. Deontology, maybe. Ontologies, no. I don't know. Okay, you guys, you were next, I think. Yes. Okay.
So
Then
one
you-
of
then you-
the things that I was really struck by your presentation and alluded to is this idea of institutional knowledge loss. That by you and your colleagues being out of your positions, I worry that some of that institutional knowledge is going to go away. And I was wondering if you think that potentially that a next administration could rebuild the infrastructure to have your office again and to really rebuild what has been destroyed.
Can I say, can we cross that bridge if we're lucky enough to get to it?
Yeah.
But like what, yes, but what, I think we're gonna live another 4 years. But how is this institutional knowledge, like how are you and your colleagues making sure that like this is stored in your brains? Like, are there documents that you still have? Like what's going on?
This is a good question. It's one I've thought about. There are some very loose and disparate initiatives underway by former federal government workers who broadly speaking, did work on human rights and development and democracy promotion and foreign policy, to try and retain those lessons, not just for historical knowledge, actually not even really primarily for historical knowledge, but largely because, as I've been saying, I think there's a lot that could be useful for applying here at home. It'd be great if some university wanted to do like an oral history project for former feds who worked on these issues at a moment when they're all cut loose. But I don't know of anything like that. We weren't allowed to take many documents with us from the government. I think some of you saw John Bolton was just prosecuted for that, so I left most everything there. So we carried it in our memories and our relationships. And if I wanted to get much more specific than I did in my speech, I'd still have to clear it with the State Department so they could make sure that I'm not saying anything that is sensitive or classified. So it's hard, but I think it's an important initiative because there is a huge class of expertise. I wonder how other countries have done it, right? I'm thinking of countries where the judiciary has been ransacked or civilian institutions have been purged. What happened to that knowledge and expertise? It's a good question. Yeah. No, there were others. You were next, and then you. Right. Okay. Go ahead.
Mine is, in a way, fairly similar to the last question, where as it concerns like the future, really. But you went through like basically the rise and fall of the U.S. interest in U.S. The role of mass atrocity prevention in U.S. foreign policy, and when or if this is ever again spoken about in the State Department as a priority and in the whole of government as a priority of U.S. foreign policy, how should we go about it differently next time, really, in the way that, because as you said, like this sort of policy making is really long term. Certain programs take decades and decades to actually get a result. So it really has to be in the room when it happens, basically, is how you put it. But how would we maintain a commitment to mass atrocity prevention in the future when or if that comes back, in the chaotic political climate? Because also because when you make something a priority of foreign policy, if you make it the most prioritized aspect of U.S. foreign policy, you are then politicizing it too. When you politicize something, you're really making it unstable and subject to much criticism and much change depending on the administration, I feel. So how would you propose we navigate that, again, in the event that it actually comes back and is actually cared about again?
I think we could do it better. I don't think there's a way to do it perfectly, and I don't think it's realistic to have this ideal that atrocity prevention could ever be like the thing. We're too big and we have too many competing interests, and that's just not how states work, right? States are never purely motivated by one thing or another. They're always motivated by a really ecumenical array of interests. I'd like it if states were also, if those interests like that quiver included an arrow of morality. But I'm under no illusion that it would be the entire quiver. I do think tons of lessons we could learn if we rebuild the architecture of atrocity prevention. Some of them are super bureaucratic. I won't bore you with them. I'm like drawing an org chart in my mind and being like, no, that office should be there, and this person should have a higher rank of undersecretary, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also the need to impose more external backstops, right? Like, for example, checks on how the U.S. imposes conditions on provision of military assistance and foreign military aid, right? It's clear that those checks were, those checkpoints were kind of blown past, right? And in many, many times, and not just the one that everybody thinks of when I say it right now, right? But many, many times, the U.S. kind of like exercised waiver provisions or found the loopholes that allowed us to not circumvent and not flout the law that Congress had legislated, but the loopholes were too big. So you got to tighten some loopholes. And then structurally, I think there has to be a reconceptualization of what it means to exercise American power, right? That we have to be humble. We have to acknowledge our past. If we're ever going to regain any of that reputational power, the only way is going to be through humility. I mean, off the record, when I was a State Department, and I would go to some countries and say, I really think you guys should do X, Y, and Z to deal with your past so you don't have atrocities in the future. Again, sometimes they would look at me and they would say, who are you to tell me what to do? I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just suggesting some things could be helpful. And they're like, I don't need your suggestions, right? And then I had to go a little bit off script and do this very human thing of diplomacy and like engage with them as a human, and say, well, I agree with you. The U.S. I needed to be humble, right? And I needed to recognize that American power was serviced by humility more than hubris. Okay, whoever has already raised their hands, raise their hands again, keep them up, and I will remember which order you were in. Okay, you, and then you, okay? Raise them high. No, you. Yes. Oh, were you next?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, sorry. You, and then you, and then you. Okay.
You came and spoke to my comparative genocides class yesterday, and one thing that was talked about was how your interactions with the White House would differ among administrations, and your effectiveness and how you're able to influence policy positions, also depending on what administration is in office. And I was curious if there was ever a moment when your work outside of Washington was ever affected by who was in office, what the administration was, or even just like parts of politics.
What do you mean, my work outside of Washington?
Just besides like influencing policy, like of the White House, if you were overseas doing something and something changed in an instant based on who was in power, like who was in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, it changed all the time. I'm trying to think of any like specific example. There were a few impolitic statements made by our president about Africa a while ago, and I did a lot of diplomacy in Africa, and many of our ambassadors there were called in and chewed out by the presidents of the country they were posted to. But I don't actually, I mean, your question actually is interesting because it makes me reflect that it actually didn't like dramatically change the way I was perceived, the way the work that I did was perceived. There were people took different approaches to the United States because they knew we cared about certain things more than others. But that's just being savvy with understanding who you're engaging with, right? Like you don't just repeat the same advocacy ask to someone if their boss is different. You change it up, right? That's how you win arguments. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, you next, and then you, okay?
So, my first question is basically on the policy. So, my question is to you, like, do you think the existing policy is like enough to like curtail the genocide, atrocity prevention? And followed by that, I would like to, like, know your recommendation if it requires any sort of like information. So that's my first question. And secondly, my question is like, I mean, I want to know about your personal opinions on like, removal of your office. So how do you see it, or what does it say? So I would just want to know your thoughts.
So the first question is about atrocity prevention generally and sort of improvements that could be made.
The US's role in it, how they actually want to prevent it. So do you think like, the way it is, working or functioning, is it enough, or do you like recommend something in that role?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of improvements to the field and architecture of atrocity prevention that could be made generally, and specifically to the way the U.S. Used it. Some of our approaches, I think, really weren't able to grapple with what Kerry doesn't want us to call upstream anymore, right? Or like long-term preventative approaches. Like we just really found it hard because it just looks like other things. We were like, okay, long-term atrocity prevention means, I don't know, food assistance. People struggled. They didn't know what an atrocity prevention intervention could look like the further away you were from hot conflicts. So I think a lot more thinking about that. I think also the field of atrocity prevention had a legacy bias towards criminal justice and criminal institutions. And that bias was a legacy of the geopolitical moment of international justice in the 90s. So it was the framework that a lot of people still reached for in the US government, especially, right? Especially the more senior people. They'd be like, oh, atrocities, you mean criminal tribunal, right? And so you operate with what you know. I think there were limitations with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So while I optimistically,
I'm sorry. I keep skipping. I keep looking him in the eye, and then someone else speaks. How about you? And then you. Okay, go ahead.
Our question is, how much influence do you think that the government should allow on like foreign countries trying to like change our population's kind of view and stance on things? Like, for example, I'm trying to use is, how Israel has an ongoing war with media trying to, apply all these deals with like YouTube and other ways to try and change the American population on, the view with, the type of relationship we have with them. Because, a lot of, Gen Z, Gen X population doesn't necessarily agree with a lot of those type of stances that our government is kind of undertaking. So like, the question is like, where do you draw the line between like just an advertisement versus foreign propaganda? Like, for example, if China started buying YouTube videos talking about like, how great their country is and how great their people is, I don't think that the US would be as lenient towards that as, what's going on with another foreign country, even though the ties we have are kind of different.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly my area of expertise, information manipulation and warfare. I guess I would say that it's important that people know where their information comes from. And if it's labeled clearly and transparently and truthfully, then My view is that people should make up their own decisions. Right? That's a very American sort of free speech way of approaching the subject of information. And I think we also have to update that for today's world where there's just tsunamis of misinformation and disinformation. And we need better media literacy in our country for people to understand what they're looking at and what they're consuming and what their diet is. That's across the political spectrum, right? Russia has engaged in very systematic disinformation and misinformation campaigns inside the United States. That was a matter of concern for the US government, right? Yeah, I don't know. Okay, now you, and then you, sir, in the back, and then you.
Maybe just, we're.
Just one more? Okay, go ahead.
So optimistically, I hope for the return of the Department of Atrocity Prevention as if the disbanding of the League of Nations eventually return with the United Nations. But realistically, in the current moment, is there any kind of method to account for this, like damage control, or is it really just a wait and see in our current moment if we could do anything about it?
I don't think it's wait and see. I think it's use different avenues and different approaches, right? I remember now, there was a second part to your question as how do I feel about my office going away? Not great. I love it. Don't love it. Wasn't happy about it. Devoted 13 years of my life to it. Kind of sad. Think we could have done a lot of good work still, right? But that kind of ties into your question, right? Like, okay, that office doesn't exist anymore. I'm not going to sit around and just wait and hope that eventually that office might exist again. I'm going to look for other structures. I'm going to look for other infrastructure, other pathways to advance this kind of work, right?
I think we should end there, but thank you very much. I'm sure for those of you who didn't get a chance